Hi, Astha. Thanks for doing an interview with Medianama. Start with a brief introduction of yourself. If you can just tell us the work you do, the work Aapti does, that'll be helpful.
Yeah, hi. Thanks so much, Sarvesh. I'm Astha Kapoor. I'm the co-founder of Aapti Institute. Aapti is a public research firm that examines the intersection between tech and society. And we've been, doing a lot of work on, two parts. One is, we examine how people access technology on the ground and, what are major questions of inclusion. And then on the other side, we look at questions of data. What happens as data becomes more and more commodified? How do you think of governance differently? And how do you think of data governance as more participative and community driven? That's our work out of the Data Economy Lab. And in that context, we've of course been looking at all the work that's happening in the Indian regulatory landscape, including, of course, the data protection bill. But before that, even things like the non-personal data committee reports, mention of how data is shared, managed in health, in agriculture, also data empowerment and protection architecture, which looks at fintech. So broadly taking the data lens on various sectors in India and really deep diving into what do all these regulations mean for the way we as individuals and communities engage with data, and what value does it add to our lives.
Okay. Talking about non-personal data, right, which we'll be focusing on for the much of this discussion. Going to the basics of why do we need sharing of non-personal data? What are the benefits we get from it? And connected to that, what's wrong with how the non-personal data sharing landscape or framework right now is?
So, I mean, in our mind, I think that non-personal data and that category needs to be examined, because I think that the way the bill, or at least the report said, is like everything that's not non-personal or that is not personal is non-personal. I think that there are certain categories of data that have value attached to it. So if you look at just mobility data, the fact that Google Maps is able to tell us how much time things are going to take, but also help cities plan for congestion, helps drivers plan their routes, etc. There's a certain value for certain kinds of information, and it needs to be shared better, it needs to be understood better, it needs to be harnessed better, and that's at the core of why quote unquote non-personal data needs to be shared, because there's a certain value attached to it. Now the question of like, who is that value important to, how do we harness it, who gets to decide what is the value of this data, and how should we unlock it, those are in the questions that various regulations and even the work that we're doing helps to answer. So I'll give you an example. Like, for instance, one of the models that we quote all the time and really like enjoy the work of is an organization which is a data cooperative based out of San Francisco that works with gig workers. And what they do is they take journey data from various gig workers, and they almost call it back and help them understand, like, hey, this is where you're making more money on Lyft versus Uber, et cetera, et cetera. And so they help them map out information that otherwise they don't have. But also what they do is they aggregate all of this data and make it available to municipalities. And drivers get to also weigh in on what municipalities should be given the data, what questions should they be able to answer from this. And so it becomes a much more interactive. Similarly, like in other parts, there are patients that might have like questions about certain kinds of health data that is not like, it's not personal because it's not personally identifiable, but it's about a disease, and you can aggregate that data and make it available to, say, a researcher to answer specific questions. But it's very much driven by the community whose data it is. Separately, there's other examples, obviously mobility is a really good one where you can aggregate certain kinds of data and make it available back to the citizens or through various apps. Transport for London does that very, very well, where questions on parking, cyclist safety, when the next train is coming, all of that is made available back to citizens. So that's the broad sort of a framework. There's a question of value, but also relatedly, how do you extract that value? Who drives that value? Who's responsible? And I guess who finds that data valuable?
Yeah. So one of the examples, right? The San Francisco example,
Uh-huh.
is that because there's some regulation or legal requirement, or all these initiatives you talked about, or on their own?
So it's on its own, I think, and there are various starting points, right? Like I think Transport for London, which is, I think, one of the examples of some of the best open data, structures where the government is making data available, actively opening up data sets, giving it to innovators and, apps like Waze, etc. To innovate on top of open data that the government is collecting, right, on mobility. That's a very peculiar example from Transport for London, and other cities have done it, LA has it, etc., etc. The example that I gave you of the data cooperative is the starting point is not making data available. The starting point is making the community more actively participate in decisions with regard to their data. But, one of the lines of revenue has become making data more available. But the value is actually of allowing drivers to collectively bargain and understand how data is being collected and what that information says about them. So there are different starting points. It's interesting that the regulation is not the imperative here. The imperative is different. We've seen some examples also come up in like indigenous data governments where indigenous communities are interested in thinking critically about what data is being collected about them and how they can use it better. So the imperative is always different, but I think what ends up happening is two-pronged. One is the involvement of the community in some shape or form in driving the use of data, and then of course the related value from it.
So in India, do you think to derive the benefits, do we have to have a government push, or do you think the market itself will slowly figure out the benefits of non-personal data, and we'll have cooperatives like the one in San Francisco come up here? What's your
It's a tough
take?
one. So if we had a data protection regulation, which we don't, right, at the moment, then my answer would be a little bit different, right? But I think that so what India does need right now is a data protection regulation. We need to understand what our rights with regard to data are, where are our protections, what are the redressals, etc. Once that's in place, I believe that a lot of innovation will occur. And we also need to understand, what the boundaries are, what data can be shared, what can, where are the concerns, where are the red lines. I think what we do need is to help understand this data value. We need also systems technological systems that will allow for aggregation, anonymization, and then relatedly the sharing infrastructure. How do we build trust in the process of sharing, right? If I know that if I share my mobility data, it's going to help solve Bangalore's traffic problem, am I going to be more inclined to do that? We were just talking to somebody who works out of Zurich. They said that people are more inclined to share data there because they A, see value in it, and B, they know that their data is safe. And I think that if we are able to create both of those circumstances where value is communicated and sharing is made safe and reliable, then innovation will occur. Then these models will likely come up. Right now, we are in a place where I don't trust the data sharing process, and I don't understand what I might get in return for sharing my data. So you're in a bit of a deadlock. I think the way to change that, of course, is the protections that the data governance, bill will hopefully bring, data protection bill will hopefully bring about, and then creating this infrastructure that says, okay, fine, this is how your data is made safe. This is how when you give your data, this is the information that you get in return. This is, and that's, I think, much easier, or not much easier, but it's relatively easier to do. And I think that there are organizations that are doing it imperfectly, for sure. But like, the government's own platform of the Indian Urban Data Exchange is thinking through some of the questions of like, okay, how do you make the cities, smart cities, share their data better? So is, almost like, and how do we enable that process of sharing? How do we create stakeholders such as like app makers or whatever, like who might be interested in receiving traffic data from 10 cities and, building something off that? Those are the types of questions that we need to answer. But I think that the starting point has to be the protections that we don't have at the moment, and keep somehow going many steps back on that.
Okay. Yeah. So now if I may come to the report, right, which the expert committee has put out on non-personal data
Yeah.
framework. Broadly, what do you think the report, like which parts do you think the report has got right, and which parts probably need a major overhaul? Just on the top of your mind.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm also even like considering the value of that report right now, where you and I are sitting like at the beginning of March in 2022, where the first report came out, I guess, in 2020, and the second one in
Yeah,
2021.
early 2021.
So yeah, so it's been a while, and since then, like so much has happened. Where first the report had suggested that there should be two regulators. Now the I keep calling it the data governance bill, but the data protection bill says that actually there should just be one regulator, and NPD is actually just personal data at the end of the day. So while I appreciate that strong protection line, I think that it's taken the conversation a little bit, or it's digressed a little bit. But if we were to just examine that report, and I've said this many times publicly as well, is that I think that was a very progressive piece of writing coming out of a government committee, and it was an excellent set of experts to ponder this. And I think that some of the stuff that they got right was just this, like the idea of value, very much so. What I didn't appreciate is this whole mandatory business. I thought it was a very high level document, right? Like, I mean, it was at least 2 to 5 years away from any kind of like, breaking it down into nitty-gritties of what it means to implement some of this. And I would have liked to see much more discussion on that document. But I think it was a good starting point to think about data value, about like what I think that saying that communities have rights to data was a really big one, to say that communities have rights to both draw value and prevent harm. We're thinking about structures such as data trust, etc. All very, very good, interesting forays into the question. But that's what it was. It was a foray. It's like dipping your toes in the water and seeing like, is it possible or not? And I think that where they got it wrong, in my view, is the whole mandatory data sharing. I think that like they made it about like, let's get data out of tech companies, but it's not that. It's about, like I said, creating that environment that makes data sharing feasible. It's not about like acquiring data and sitting on it. How are you going to process it? How are you going to draw value from it? How are you going to analyze it? Those questions were not answered. It was just about like, let's get this data out of tech companies and give it to small startups, etc. I just thought that though that was a bit ham-handed in the way that it was approached, but broadly, like the premise is right. And some of the more sort of like intellectual views of rights were also correct to me. But then when it came to the actual nitty-gritties and figuring out how this was going to happen, what was the broader ecosystem that was required, all of that, I think that the committee sort of didn't really flesh out, and that's fine. Like, we should have been, we should have had, we should, not should have, should have the time to talk about it much more. But the problem is that now with the data protection bill, things have just like are weird. We don't even know if there's going to be a bill or there's going to be a new committee. And
Well, yeah, what do you think? Should we have to separate regulators, or
have two separate regulators, but I think that non-personal data, if we are going down the route of regulating non-personal data, should be thought about separately. So there should be more discussion, debate about what is the ecosystem that's required to govern non-personal data. If not, then like I said, you should start to create, if you should have strong protections for personal data and then create an ecosystem that allows for the sharing of non-personal data. And that could be an initial way. And when you're at a point where a lot of non-personal data is being shared, is being moved from point A to point B, you can think about how to govern it better. That's where I would be. I think that we were very early on the NPD question, which is fine. Like I said, like it's good to start that conversation. But I think that it needs a lot more thinking about like what data, how to share, what are the systems, what are the standards, interoperability, who's going to do it. All of those were open
So
for
should we
the report.
wait until, so do you think we should wait until the personal data protection bill is out and it's finalized and we see how it works for like a couple of years and then start making moves on the NPD front?
I would say, of course, I mean, first of all, the personal data protection bill is like just taken such an. It's also now called, like I said, like they've collapsed NPD
Yeah,
also.
as a,
It's
yeah.
just a broader data protection bill, which is interesting. And I think that, again, like I'm okay with there not being two regulators. In any case, it's going to be a regulatory hodgepodge. Nobody knows how that's going to like really work out. But I think I would actually, I would be interested in a more consultative process on the NPD at the moment. So let the DPA come into play, right? Like we have 24 months or before the DPA. Let's use that time to start really critically thinking about some of the recommendations. I would love to see another draft of the committee's report. We all sent in another set of comments. I've heard that there's a draft law sitting in MeitY. I would have actually liked to see one more draft from the committee. Would have liked to see some potential areas for experimentation, have some open calls, maybe house at universities to see what is the broader ecosystem that's required. They'd mentioned things like data trust, which I thought was like the highest level and really needed to be unbundled much more. So I would be of the view that if we have 24 months to the DPA, let's use that time to really like design a consultative process for NPD and start to really create avenues which involve various stakeholders to see, okay, fine, if we want to share health data, and they said that health is a big like potential use case for NPD, what does that really take? And do more sectoral consultations, talk to the big stakeholders in the health sector and see what their challenges are and really use that time. And I think the committee would be well suited to do that. And I know that like committees are not structured to do this, but like do road shows, talk to people, like make that process more consultative. And we've seen try do that very well on several questions. There's no reason for the NPD committee not to do it. But again, like I don't the committee's work is done from what I understand, and now there's like apparently some
Oh, it's just
document.
the finalization part that they're
Yeah,
taking
but
about.
where, who, what, how?
Yeah.
Like the new bill says that the government just needs a policy like at some point. So in my mind, I think that the NPD conversation is really like been derailed, which may not be the worst outcome because it gives everybody some time to think about what needs to happen. But again, like I thought there were good things in the NPD committee report, like the whole idea of community rights is good, and data as a relational good, all of that, all of those have vanished somewhere in the ether. So I don't know what's going to emerge now and in the app. So if they had even just said like, here's the final report, here's the potential next steps, here's what we think the private sector should do, etc. If that kind of direction had also come from the committee, right, like that would have been a good starting point to start thinking about it. And like I said, that we have some time before the DPA comes into play. By then we would have had an interesting ecosystem for NPD as well.
How are other countries dealing with in terms of the regulations front? Is there some country that's doing it particularly well that we can borrow? What's the international precedent on this?
So the EU has, an NPD sharing document, free flow of NPD, I think it's called. And other than that, like, there's not, there's some activity from other countries, like, Australia has some mandatory sharing in the automobile sector, etc. So I think it's still very new in different parts of the world. And I think that there isn't a model that you can rely on. What we had recommended in our work for NPD, and we were specifically dealing with the question of like, should NPD sharing be made mandatory? And what we thought was interesting and important to do is, like I said, and I'm sort of repeating myself, is to create this ecosystem. And we found that in places where a broader data sharing ecosystem exists, that's where the NPD sharing was better. So we looked at, say, Finland health data, and they have, it was a 20-year cycle of getting to a point where health data for research can be shared through their fin data thing. So I think that those are the kinds of things that needed to be done. So other countries had, for instance, made not sharing data, but like interoperability was made mandatory first, for instance, right? And that just, like I said, like creates the ecosystem. And I think that that's where we sort of missed the, not the bus as much as like the whole point of what was supposed to happen, because we just put in the NPD report, we were trying to answer for both public value as well as antitrust through the mandatory sharing question, and as a result of which we sort of like failed. And what we recommended is that you need to have that ecosystem like in other countries. And like I said, Finland is something we looked at, where you could see that countries had spent a lot of time beginning to digitize. Like the efforts for digitization are very poor right now in India, particularly like in the health sector, where data exists in all sorts of places. And so the effort to digitize was limited. The effort to make things interoperable, create cross-sectoral sharing, all of those were not necessarily pushed in. And for us, I think that to develop a robust non-personal data ecosystem, I think we need to just like stagger it. So we'd say, we for us, a roadmap would be like, let's assess the risk and what does it mean for a particular sector to share NPD. Let's define the rights of the community. What public value are we really looking to extract? Let's empower a sectoral regulator first. So for instance, if it's health data, then can the NDHM really look into it, and then start to build standards, see if you can have some kind of like a sandbox situation where you can experiment what that looks like, pilot, build the infrastructure, refine the pilots. Like, so I think that it's a much longer process, and all the countries that we studied have actually invested in that long process where you, like I said, digitize, do the pilots, figure out what interoperability looks like, create that infrastructure for sharing.
It took like 20 years in Finland, right? For them
it took 20 years in Finland. So and I think that you can't rush into it, right? And so when we looked at the Finland process and we sort of mapped that to India, we realized that India hasn't really done the work. And even if you want to squish the timelines, you still have to knock off those steps. So I think that's where we feel things were missing in the way that India has done it. And there's no one way, but like I think that even in the process, I think that we need to figure out what comes first, and making things mandatory, really focusing on sharing, that doesn't come first at all. Everything that we studied and we looked at also is like several active pilots that were done in say a Bangalore versus a France, and we realized that even in the existing efforts, what's happened is that India is so focused on data like itself that you don't really focus on the value of data and how to extract that. And so you just get like really sort of lost in sitting on data. So, we looked at the Bangalore Mysore, you know, partnership between BMTC and PwC and MapUnity. And then we also looked at this similar effort in France. And what we realized is that in France, there was a lot of citizen interaction. So really citizens were very much part of that process. The focus was on data utilization and not on data extraction in that sense. So that really changed the way stakeholders interacted. Whereas even in the existing pilots in India, it was all, data was lying there, but it was underused because various stakeholders didn't have the capacity. So I think those are the kinds of questions that you need to answer for NPD, and those are the examples that you should lean on much, much more.
Okay. And so coming to another aspect of this, right? One of the objectives of the government was to break down data monopolies. Like there are data monopolies who have a lot of data that can, if shared, will be useful for others and will promote competition, right? That's what they said. But will it actually address these antitrust concerns, or is data monopolies going to continue to exist regardless of whether such sharing happens?
So like I said, the effort was two-pronged, right? Oh, let's create public value and let's break down, look at antitrust. I don't know if the job of the NPD committee was to really think about antitrust. I just sort of put it in. I think that the value question was the right starting point, because antitrust is are you allowing new players to access markets? Is it enhancing consumer choice? Are we, promoting collaboration? Is the economy getting more diversified? And, are we really looking at innovation? That's how at least we broke down the questions of antitrust. And again, we realized that it actually doesn't do any of that. It's not like if you make NPD data sharing mandatory, what's going to happen, and this was also said multiple times even at your panel, is that it's going to disincentivize certain kinds of data collection processing. And what you're going to have is an ecosystem where certain kinds of data is in any case not made available, and people are just finding ways to scuttle the regulation as opposed to complying. So we thought that, again, if you build an ecosystem based sharing approach, because there's a broader trust in the ecosystem, opportunities for smaller businesses would be much, much more, and people would be incentivized to participate, as opposed to the stick approach that even in the EU, there's a certain sense of data altruism. There are incentives that are created as opposed to the stick approach that the NPD took. And yeah, I think that's a very that's a tricky place to be in, because you can't have such a complex idea being made mandatory, where a lot of the burden for making data available, accessible, usable is on tech companies.
So when you talk about these incentive-based system, right?
Yeah.
So what are some, can you give me an example of some incentive that will work for companies to, actively participate in the sharing?
Yeah, so, again, I've had members of the committee disagree with me, and it seems naive to them, though I don't believe so. But I think that, like I said, incentives the starting point is, of course, that tech companies are also invested in certain public questions, right? I think that that the collaboration between, say, a BMTC and a Google Maps is an important one, and those exist as well. So I think that for us, incentives are complex. I think that the tech companies are saying oh, incentives should be monetary, let's put a data marketplace. I don't know if that's the right answer, though it could be one of the many incentives, because it's a complex thing to structure. So one is, of course, a financial incentives, that if you want certain kinds of data, you go to this marketplace and you're able to purchase it, and tech companies get remunerated for it. Those are complex, need to be understood much better, need to be made sure how, like, you don't
Yeah, we
create
don't even know how to
monopolies
value data, right?
in. Exactly. And there are some models around, but I don't know if they're good ones. Is Google's data more valuable than that of a smaller mobility startup? Is my data as an urban woman more valuable than that of someone else? Like, I don't know. So, and there are some, mathematical models, and people are trying to think through some of this. And I think that's a complex thing, and needs, again, more deliberation. We think that there's a, you could have incentives should solve for trust, they should solve for capacity, they should solve for involvement, right? Tech companies want to collaborate with the government. If you talk to anybody, right, they'd be very happy to do some work with the government on certain kinds of questions. So I think that, and also they'd be very interested in receiving government data. So one incentive for me, I think, that we clarified also in our work was that, can you have some symbiotic sharing? So it can't just be B2G sharing, but it should also be G2B sharing, right? Like, so that could be one kind of incentive where the government is also, making its data available to stakeholders, which the government is not very good at the moment.
I mean, that is a good example, right? If they first started sharing all that's in their possession and then
Yeah.
showed what value is coming out of it, to even like incentivize others to do.
And now they've just got that national data accessibility policy, which came out like a few days ago, which
Yeah.
is very vague and very strange. And they seem to want to monetize public resources like data. I don't think that's the answer. I think it has to be more nuanced than that. It could be the starting point, again, to have a much broader discussion on making public data accessible. But I think that would be a good starting point to do so. The second, again, is like the solution collaboration, where you bring in private sector partners on specific solutions. Bangalore traffic, of course, for anyone who lives here, is a big issue, and we're always like, but why are we living in this like tech city and nobody's been able to solve this? I think that that's a really like life question. Have a specific problem, bring in stakeholders to solve that. If public value is indeed your goal, there are ways of doing it, involving stakeholders and making them part of that solution, as opposed to treating them as like, oh, you're just going to give us data and we will solve for it. I don't think that anyone's going to like be into that. So you could have certain like data goals for every city or every like state or whatever, to say like, this year we are going to have XYZ data goals, and we invite tech sectors to come and help us collaborate and do it properly. And I think those could be interesting ways of and again, like, sandboxes are also understood, but we could also see what that framework looks like. But the idea is to collaborate on solutions with the government. So get the government to give data, help the government collaborate much more, and then the monetization question can be also considered, but again, I would put that much lower. And then again, like, create trust in the process of sharing, right? Like, I think that in itself is a really big incentive for people to participate. Is that if I know that my data is going to be used in a trustworthy manner for public value, I'll be more inclined to give it. And there are some surveys globally, at least at the citizen level, and also I think in like for companies, that like if they knew that data was being used for public issues, and we've seen that in COVID, right? People have been much more altruistic with regard to their data.
Yeah. Google started sharing a lot of data, I think.
Exactly. And there are precedents, and I think we should ride on that. So, and I'm not saying that like tech companies are altruistic, but I think that there are ways to maneuver that without the stick approach, which never works, right? Like, stick approaches always create black markets and create ways in which people scuttle regulation as opposed to participate in it. And I think that that's what we should really look to create.
Okay. Just to wrap up the discussion, what should be the immediate next steps for the government on this front?
NPD, I would say, like, I would extend the term of the committee. I would put out one more draft to start off with. I would love I know if the rumors are to be believed, there's a draft waiting. I think that the committee, it should still remain in the committee's ambit as opposed to going into the government just yet, because the committee is a group of experts, and I don't think we're at that stage where the government can just take that document, at least the last form that you and I saw it in, and make it into something real. I think we need to prolong the process. I think we need more consultations on this. And I think that it was a very exciting committee that was set up. I think it was, the right set of people. And I think we should put out one more draft for consultation. I don't think that we're ready to move this on. So take the time and I think do more consultation around NPD.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Astha. Thanks for your time.